The lighthouse stood like a broken finger against the storm-dark sky, its paint peeling in long, serpentine strips that curled and twisted in the Atlantic wind. Marcus Cole pressed his weathered hands against the steering wheel of his battered pickup truck, the engine ticking as it cooled in the gravel driveway that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. Beside him, Rex, a German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a slight limp from their shared tours in Afghanistan, lifted his head and whined softly, a sound that always meant trouble was coming. "I know, boy," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse from years of screaming orders over the thunder of helicopters and the crack of gunfire. "This place feels wrong to me, too." The letter from the probate attorney crinkled in his jacket pocket as he stepped out into the salt-heavy air. Uncle Jeremiah, his father's brother, whom he'd met exactly 3 times in his 38 years, had left him this lighthouse and the 17 acres of rocky Maine coastline it commanded. The inheritance had come with a single cryptic note written in shaky handwriting: "The sins of the past demand a keeper. You'll understand soon enough." Marcus had driven up from Boston that morning, fleeing the cramped apartment where the walls seemed to close in a little more each day, where the nightmares echoed off empty rooms and Rex's concerned panting was the only sound that made sense anymore. The VA checks covered rent and food, but they couldn't buy him peace, couldn't silence the ghosts that whispered his name in the dark hours before dawn. Rex bounded ahead as they approached the lighthouse, his tail wagging despite the apprehension Marcus felt radiating from his own chest. The dog had saved his life twice in Helmand Province, once by detecting an IED buried beneath a children's playground, and once by dragging him behind cover when sniper fire erupted during what was supposed to be a peaceful patrol. Rex understood darkness in ways most creatures never would, which made his sudden enthusiasm all the more unsettling. The lighthouse door hung slightly ajar, revealing a slice of blackness that seemed to swallow the afternoon light. He pulled out his phone to use as a flashlight, but the screen remained stubbornly dark despite showing full battery just moments before. He tried the power button, held it down, shook the device, nothing. "Technology," he muttered, though something cold crawled up his spine. Rex had stopped wagging his tail. The hinges groaned like tortured metal as Marcus pushed the door fully open. The smell hit him immediately, salt and decay, but underneath that, something else. Something that reminded him of the field hospital after the mortar attack, metallic and sharp and wrong. He'd learned to trust his nose in the desert. It had kept him alive when his eyes and ears failed him. "Hello?" His voice vanished into the circular interior, without even the courtesy of an echo. "Anyone here?" Rex padded inside ahead of him, nose to the ground, following some scent trail invisible to human senses. The interior of the lighthouse was a study in neglect. Dust particles danced in the weak shafts of light that managed to penetrate the grime-covered windows, and the iron spiral staircase that wound up toward the light chamber was streaked with rust that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Marcus ran his fingers along the stone walls, feeling the dampness seep through his skin. The blocks were massive, quarried from Maine granite and fitted together with the kind of precision that spoke of old-world craftsmanship. But carved into several of the stones, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated grime, were symbols he didn't recognize. They looked almost like letters, but from no alphabet he'd ever seen. The grooves were deep, deliberately made, and when he traced them with his fingertip, they felt warm despite the lighthouse's bone-deep chill. "What were you hiding up here, Uncle Jeremiah?" Marcus whispered to the empty air. Rex barked once, sharp and urgent from somewhere deeper in the lighthouse. It was his alert bark, the one that had preceded every ambush, every hidden explosive, every moment when death had reached out with eager fingers only to be thwarted by the dog's supernatural instincts. Marcus found Rex in what must have been a storage room, pawing at a heavy wooden chest pushed against the far wall. The chest was old, really old, with iron bands that had oxidized to a deep orange brown, and a lock that looked like it belonged in a museum. But what made Marcus's breath catch in his throat were the fresh scratches in the wood around the lock, as if someone had recently tried to pry it open with a crowbar or knife. "Easy, Rex. Easy, boy." Marcus knelt beside his companion, running gentle fingers through the dog's thick fur. Rex was trembling, not with fear, but with excitement, the way he used to tremble when they were closing in on a high-value target. "What is it? What do you smell?" He'd tried to lift the chest, but it was impossibly heavy, as if it were filled with stones or metal. The wood was smooth beneath his hands, worn by decades of handling, and carved into the lid was an elaborate design that made his eyes water to look at directly. Ships and waves and tentacled things that couldn't possibly be real, all intertwined in a pattern that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking straight at it. As his fingers traced the carving, a sharp pain lanced through his skull, sudden and brutal, like the migraines he'd suffered after the IED blast that had ended his military career. But this was different. This pain came with images. A ship with black sails cutting through fog-shrouded waters. Men with cutlasses and pistols, their faces painted with greed and something darker. A captain with a missing eye and hands stained with blood, counting golden coins by candlelight while his crew slept uneasily in hammocks below. And treasure, mountains of it, glittering in torchlight as it was lowered into hidden chambers carved from living rock. Marcus jerked his hands back from the chest, gasping. The pain in his head faded, but the images remained, burned into his memory like photographs. Rex whined and pressed against his leg, offering the comfort that had gotten Marcus through his darkest moments. "I'm okay, boy. I'm okay." But even as he said it, Marcus knew it was a lie. Nothing about this place was okay. He stood up slowly, his knees creaking with the sound of a man who'd spent too many years carrying too much weight over too many miles. The afternoon light filtering through the storage room's single window was already beginning to fade, and he realized with a start that he'd been in the lighthouse for over an hour. It had felt like minutes. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A piece of paper wedged between the chest and the wall, yellowed with age and covered in his uncle's familiar spidery handwriting. Marcus pulled it free, squinting to make out the words in the dim light. "The dreams started the day I inherited this place, just like they started for my father before me, and his father before him. The Blackwater Brotherhood chose this spot for a reason, Marcus. They knew the old gods still listened here, still demanded their due. The treasure is real. 2.5 centuries of accumulated wealth from every ship they took, every port they sacked, and every life they claimed in service to powers that should have stayed buried beneath the waves. I tried to leave. God knows I tried. But the lighthouse calls you back, boy. It gets in your blood, in your dreams, in your very soul. I've kept the watch for 43 years, kept the light burning, kept the hungry dark at bay. But I'm tired now, and the spirits are getting stronger. They whisper of things hidden in the deep places, of maps drawn in blood and sealed with sacrifice. Find the map, Marcus. Find it, before they do. The Blackwater captain's treasure wasn't just gold and jewels. It was power, raw and terrible power that could reshape the world if it fell into the wrong hands. But beware the price of seeking it. Every treasure map written by cursed hands demands payment in blood and soul. The dog will know. Animals always know when the old magic stirs. Trust him more than you trust your own eyes, because this place will lie to you, will show you things that never were and never should be. Keep the light burning, nephew. No matter what else happens, keep the light burning." Marcus read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling slightly. Rex had begun to pace, his nails clicking against the stone floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like Morse code. The afternoon was dying outside, and already the lighthouse felt different, more alive somehow, as if the approaching darkness was awakening something that slept during the day. He folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket alongside the inheritance documents. Whatever Uncle Jeremiah had gotten himself mixed up in, whatever family curse or local legend had driven him to madness and early death, Marcus was apparently neck-deep in it now. But as he stood in that storage room, with Rex pressed against his leg and the mysterious chest looming like a monument to secrets, Marcus Cole felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years of civilian life: purpose. The crushing weight of empty days and sleepless nights suddenly felt lighter, replaced by the familiar tension of a mission with real stakes. "Come on, Rex," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Let's go see what we've inherited." As they climbed the spiral staircase toward the light chamber, the last rays of sunlight painted the walls in shades of gold and crimson. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was climbing up behind them, following in their footsteps with patient, ancient hunger. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkening Atlantic, and in its glow, Marcus could swear he saw ships on the horizon, tall ships with black sails, moving against the wind. The first night in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, Marcus didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the vision from the chest, pirates and treasure, and something vast and tentacled moving beneath dark waters. Rex patted the small bedroom restlessly, his claws clicking against the hardwood floors that creaked with every footstep, every shift of weight, every breath of wind against the lighthouse's weathered walls. At 0300 hours, he still thought in military time, probably always would, Marcus gave up on sleep and made his way to the kitchen. The quarters were spartanly furnished, clearly the home of a man who had grown used to solitude. A single chair at a table meant for two. One plate, one cup, one set of silverware washed and waiting in the dish rack. Books everywhere, though. Maritime history, local folklore, genealogical records of Maine coastal families dating back to the 1600s. And journals. Dozens of them filled with Uncle Jeremiah's increasingly erratic handwriting. He opened the refrigerator, hoping for coffee or at least something caffeinated, but found only spoiled milk and a few cans of beer with an expiration date from 6 months ago. The pantry yielded instant coffee and a box of stale crackers. As he waited for the water to boil, he picked up one of Jeremiah's journals at random and flipped it open. June 15th. The dreams are getting worse. Last night I dreamed I was underwater, swimming down through fathoms of black water toward a light that shouldn't exist. When I got close enough to see what was glowing, it was the lighthouse beam, but it was shining up from the ocean floor, and there were shapes moving around it. Human shapes, but wrong somehow. They had too many joints in their arms, and their faces. God forgive me. Their faces were the faces of everyone who ever died in these waters. Every fisherman lost in a storm. Every sailor claimed by the rocks. Every passenger on every ship the Blackwater Brotherhood ever sent to the bottom. They were all there, swimming in circles around that impossible light, and they were all looking up at me with empty eye sockets full of bioluminescent fish. When I woke up, my sheets were soaked with seawater. Marcus closed the journal and set it aside, his hands trembling slightly. Rex padded into the kitchen and sat beside his chair, leaning his warm weight against Marcus's leg. The dog's presence was grounding, a reminder that not everything in this place was touched by madness and salt-soaked nightmares. "At least I'm not losing my mind, huh, boy?" Marcus scratched behind Rex's ears, earning a soft whine of concern, though I'm not sure that's actually comforting. He spent the rest of the night reading through more journals, each one documenting Uncle Jeremiah's slow descent into obsession. The entries began normally enough: maintenance logs for the lighthouse equipment, notes about supply deliveries, observations of weather patterns and ship traffic. But gradually they became stranger. References to the Blackwater spirits and the deep voices began appearing. Sketches of symbols that matched the ones carved into the lighthouse walls filled the margins, and always mentions of the chest in the storage room and the terrible weight of its contents. September 3rd. I tried to burn the chest today. Doused it with gasoline and lit a match, but the flames wouldn't take. They turned blue and cold, and I swear I heard voices singing in languages that predate human speech. The chest wasn't even scorched. Whatever's inside, whatever the Blackwater captain sealed away, it doesn't want to be destroyed. I understand now why Father never left this place, why Grandfather died raving about cursed gold and blood-soaked maps. We're not keepers of the light. We're guards. We're the prison wardens for something that should never see daylight again. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the lighthouse walls in soft pastels, Marcus found himself standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the endless expanse of gray water. Rex had finally settled into an uneasy sleep on the worn rug, but even in slumber, the dog's ears twitched at sounds Marcus couldn't hear. The morning brought visitors. Marcus was attempting to coax life from Uncle Jeremiah's ancient coffee maker when he heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. Through the window, he watched a pristine white SUV pull up beside his battered pickup truck. 3 people climbed out: a woman in an expensive business suit, a man with the hard look of private security, and someone Marcus immediately pegged as a lawyer despite never having seen him before. Rex was awake instantly, his hackles raised and a low growl building in his throat. The dog positioned himself between Marcus and the door, every muscle tense with anticipation. Easy, Rex. Let's see what they want. The woman knocked with the kind of authority that suggested she wasn't used to being kept waiting. When Marcus opened the door, she flashed a smile that was all perfect teeth and practiced warmth, but her eyes remained cold as winter ocean. Mr. Cole, my name is Victoria Harrington, and I represent certain interested parties who would very much like to discuss your recent inheritance. Her accent was carefully neutral, but Marcus caught traces of something European beneath the polished pronunciation. May we come in? That depends on what you want to discuss. Marcus kept his hand on the doorframe, blocking their entry. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming danger. The security man shifted slightly, his jacket falling open just enough to reveal the shoulder holster beneath. Victoria noticed Marcus's attention, and her smile became even more predatory. Perhaps we could speak more privately. What I have to offer might be of considerable interest to a man in your circumstances. My circumstances? A disabled veteran living on government assistance, inheriting property he can't afford to maintain, struggling with what the military so euphemistically calls adjustment issues. She tilted her head, studying him with the clinical interest of a scientist examining a specimen. I've done my research, Mr. Cole. Your service record, your medical history, your financial situation, it's all quite comprehensive. Rex's growl deepened, and Marcus felt his own temper rising. But he'd learned hard lessons about controlling his anger, about the consequences of letting combat reflexes take over in civilian situations. You've got 60 seconds to tell me what you want, then you're leaving. Victoria's smile never wavered. Very direct. I appreciate that in a man. Very well. We represent a consortium of collectors interested in maritime antiquities. We have reason to believe your uncle possessed certain items of historical significance, and we're prepared to offer you a substantial sum for access to his collection. What kind of items? Documents, maps, perhaps artifacts recovered from local shipwrecks. She paused, watching his face carefully. Items that might be of more value to the right buyers than they would be to someone with no understanding of their true significance.
$2 million. It was more money than Marcus had ever imagined having, enough to disappear somewhere warm and quiet where the nightmares couldn't follow, where Rex could run on beaches without the sound of distant gunfire echoing in their ears. "We'll need an answer today," Victoria added. "Our clients are not patient people, and there are other parties interested in this location, less civilized parties, shall we say." "I need time to think about it." "Of course, but Mr. Cole—" Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something predatory and ancient beneath the polished exterior. "Time is a luxury you may not have. This lighthouse has a long history of attracting the wrong kind of attention. It would be unfortunate if you followed your uncle's path to an early grave." The threat was delivered with the same pleasant tone she'd used to discuss money, but Rex had heard enough. The German shepherd lunged forward, not to attack, but to position himself directly between the strangers and Marcus, his teeth bared in a snarl that spoke of barely controlled violence. "I think you should leave," Marcus said quietly. "Now." Victoria nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Cole. Do try to keep an open mind about our offer, and do try to stay safe. These old lighthouses can be so terribly dangerous." They drove away as smoothly as they'd arrived, leaving Marcus standing in the doorway with Rex pressed against his leg and a cold certainty growing in his chest. Whatever Uncle Jeremiah had hidden, whatever secret the Blackwater Brotherhood had died to protect, it was valuable enough to kill for. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of nervous energy. Marcus tried to occupy himself with practical tasks, inspecting the lighthouse mechanism, testing the backup generators, cataloging the supplies in the storage rooms, but his attention kept drifting back to the chest, to the symbols carved in the walls, to the growing certainty that he was being watched. Rex confirmed his suspicions around noon, barking sharply at the kitchen window. Marcus looked out to see a figure standing on the rocky shoreline about a quarter-mile away, too distant to make out details, but close enough to be clearly human. The figure stood motionless for nearly 10 minutes, then simply vanished as if it had never been there at all. "This is insane," Marcus muttered, but even as he said it, he was checking the locks on all the doors and windows. "We're losing our minds, Rex, just like Uncle Jeremiah." But Rex didn't seem insane. The dog was alert and focused in a way Marcus hadn't seen since their last patrol in Helmand Province, when they'd been hunting a Taliban bomb maker through the labyrinthian alleys of a hostile village. Rex's instincts had saved their entire squad that day, leading them away from a building rigged with enough explosives to level a city block. If Rex said something was wrong with this place, something was wrong with this place. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that probably qualified as either brilliant or suicidal, depending on your perspective. He was going to open the chest. He'd served 3 tours in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth, had survived ambushes and roadside bombs and firefights that left stronger men broken and gibbering. He wasn't going to be intimidated by some maritime folklore and his uncle's paranoid journal entries. Whatever was in that chest, whatever truth lay behind the Blackwater Brotherhood legend, he was going to face it head-on. Rex followed him down to the storage room, but the dog's enthusiasm had been replaced with nervous energy. He paced in tight circles while Marcus examined the ancient lock on the lid, whining softly in the back of his throat. "I know, boy. I know this is stupid." Marcus knelt beside the chest, running his fingers over the intricate carving on its lid. "But we can't spend the rest of our lives running from shadows and half-remembered nightmares. Sometimes you gotta face the darkness to find your way back to the light."
The lock was old but well-maintained, its mechanism smooth despite the centuries of salt air and neglect. Marcus had learned lockpicking during his army days, a useful skill when you needed to secure abandoned buildings or access enemy installations. This lock was more complex than most, with multiple tumblers and what felt like additional mechanisms built into its core, but it yielded eventually to patient manipulation. As the lock clicked open, Rex's whining intensified. The dog backed toward the doorway, every instinct screaming retreat, but he didn't leave. Rex had never abandoned Marcus in the field, and he wasn't going to start now. Marcus lifted the heavy lid and immediately understood why his uncle had spent 43 years guarding this chest. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had somehow remained supple despite its obvious age, was a map. But this wasn't some faded piece of parchment drawn by long-dead pirates. This map seemed to glow with its own internal light, its lines and symbols shifting subtly as Marcus watched. The coastline of Maine was clearly visible, rendered in extraordinary detail, but overlaid with markings that belonged to no modern cartographer. Beneath the map were other items, a brass compass whose needle spun wildly before settling on a bearing that definitely wasn't magnetic north, a leather-bound journal filled with entries written in multiple hands and languages, and a small wooden box that felt warm to the touch despite the storage room's chill. But it was the map that held Marcus's attention. As he stared at its impossible surface, images began to form in his mind. Not the violent flashes he'd experienced when first touching the chest, but clear, detailed visions that felt more like memories than hallucinations. A ship called the Crimson Tide, its black sails pregnant with unnatural wind as it cut through fog-shrouded waters toward a hidden cove. Captain Ezra Blackwater, his ruined face half hidden behind a mask of hammered silver, directing his crew as they hauled chest after chest of plundered treasure into caves carved from living rock. And something else, something that made Marcus's blood run cold. A ritual performed by moonlight on a beach stained with the blood of innocence as Blackwater offered his stolen wealth to powers that dwelt in the deepest trenches of the ocean. "The treasure's real," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above Rex's anxious panting. "God help me, it's all real." But as he spoke, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. The map was changing, its glowing lines shifting to reflect not the coastline as it had been 3 centuries ago, but as it existed today. Modern landmarks appeared and disappeared, roads and buildings flickering into existence like ghosts of the present, overlaying the bones of the past. And there, pulsing with soft golden light, was a location marker that definitely hadn't been there when he'd first opened the chest. It was positioned about 3 miles offshore, in waters that should have been too deep for any treasure cave or hidden cove. The marker was moving, drifting slowly but steadily toward shore. Rex barked once, sharp and urgent, and Marcus looked up to see that the afternoon light filtering through the storage room window had taken on a greenish cast, as if they were underwater. But when he blinked and looked again, everything appeared normal. "We're in trouble, aren't we, boy?" Marcus carefully rewrapped the map and closed the chest, but he could still feel its presence like a weight in his chest. Whatever Uncle Jeremiah was trying to keep locked away, I think I just woke it up. As if in response to his words, a sound echoed through the lighthouse, distant and mournful, like the call of a foghorn, but wrong somehow. Too organic, too much like a voice crying out across vast distances of salt water and time. Rex pressed against his leg, and Marcus drew comfort from the dog's warm presence. They'd faced worse things together, he told himself. They'd survived the desert, survived the bombs and bullets, and the slow poison of memories that wouldn't stay buried. But as they climbed the spiral staircase back to the keeper's quarters, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer alone in the lighthouse. Something was stirring in the deep places, something that had been waiting centuries for the right person to open the right door. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly toward the horizon, but Marcus could swear he saw shapes moving beneath its gray surface, vast, patient shapes that had been dreaming in the depths since before his ancestors first set foot on American soil. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkening water, and for just a moment, Marcus thought he saw it reflected back from something enormous and impossible, something that shouldn't exist in any rational universe. But Rex was beside him, solid and real and unshakably loyal, and that was enough to keep the darkness at bay. For now. The dreams began that very night, vivid and terrible in ways that made Marcus's war nightmares seem like pleasant daydreams. He found himself standing on the deck of a ship that reeked of blood and brine, watching as Captain Ezra Blackwater carved symbols into the flesh of a screaming prisoner, while his crew chanted in voices that belonged to no human throat. The prisoner's blood ran in rivulets across the deck, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. And when it reached the ocean, the water began to glow with a sickly phosphorescence. "You see now," Blackwater said without turning around, his voice carrying easily over the storm winds that whipped his black coat like living shadow. "You understand what your bloodline has bound you to guard." Marcus tried to speak, tried to move, but found himself frozen in place like a statue carved from salt-stained wood. He could only watch as the ritual continued, as more prisoners were dragged from the hold, men, women, even children, all of them bearing the terrified expressions of people who knew they were about to die for something far worse than mere pirate greed. "The old gods demand tribute," Blackwater continued, finally turning to face Marcus. His silver mask caught the lightning that split the sky, reflecting it back in patterns that seemed to burn themselves into Marcus's retinas. Gold and jewels are worthless to beings who ruled the ocean before mammals crawled onto land. But blood is the currency of power, blood and fear and the slow corruption of innocent souls. The captain gestured toward the horizon where something vast moved beneath the storm-tossed waves. It was too large to comprehend, too alien to process, but Marcus's mind tried anyway. Tentacles thick as subway tunnels, eyes like burning stars scattered across a head that could swallow battleships, and underneath it all, an intelligence so ancient and malevolent that its mere presence threatened to shatter his sanity like glass. "Your family has guarded our secret for generations, boy. Your blood is tied to ours now, bound by oaths sworn in darkness and sealed in salt water. You can run from this lighthouse, you can try to forget what you've seen, but the deep ones are patient. They'll wait for you to come back, and eventually you will. They all do." Marcus woke with a gasp that turned into a scream, his body drenched in sweat that reeked of seawater and decay. Rex was beside him instantly, whining and pawing at his chest, trying to anchor him back to reality. But even with the dog's warm presence, even with the familiar surroundings of Uncle Jeremiah's bedroom, Marcus could still feel the weight of that ancient attention pressing down on him. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, though his voice shook with each word. "Just a dream. Just another nightmare."
But Rex's hackles were raised, and the dog kept glancing toward the window where the lighthouse beam swept across waters that seemed to writhe with unnatural movement. Whatever Marcus had experienced, Rex had felt it too. "I think I know how to reinforce the prison, but the cost is more than any one man should have to pay. It requires a willing sacrifice, someone whose bloodline is tied to the original binding. Someone like me. Someone like Marcus when his time comes." Marcus set the journal down with trembling hands, his coffee forgotten and growing cold. Rex whined softly and pressed against his leg, offering what comfort he could. But the dog's presence couldn't dispel the cold certainty that was spreading through Marcus's chest. He was trapped. Just like Uncle Jeremiah. Just like his grandfather and great-grandfather before him. Whatever deal the Blackwater captain had made with the things that dwelt in the deep places, it had bound Marcus's entire family to this lighthouse, to this terrible responsibility. As if summoned by his thoughts, a sound echoed across the water, low and mournful and utterly inhuman. Rex bolted upright, a growl building in his throat, and Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had kept him alive through countless firefights and ambushes. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and made his way to the lighthouse's observation deck, Rex close at his heels.
The Atlantic stretched out before them, dark and restless under the pre-dawn sky. But there was something moving on the water that definitely wasn't natural. Ships. 3 of them, maybe 4, their black sails pregnant with wind that seemed to blow from no earthly source. They moved against the current and the prevailing winds, cutting through the waves with impossible grace. And as Marcus watched through the lighthouse's powerful lens, he could see figures moving on their decks, tall, gaunt figures in rotting naval uniforms who moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes controlled by invisible strings. "The Blackwater Brotherhood," Marcus whispered, the words tasting of salt and grave dirt. "They're coming back." Rex barked once, sharp and urgent, and Marcus followed the dog's gaze to see lights moving on the shoreline below. Flashlights, he thought at first. But the quality of the illumination was wrong, too cold, too blue, like bioluminescent algae given form and purpose. Victoria Harrington and her team had returned, but they weren't alone. Marcus counted at least a dozen figures moving along the rocky coast, some carrying equipment that looked disturbingly like military hardware, others bearing items that belonged in no rational universe, carved totems that seemed to writhe with their own internal movement, containers filled with liquid that glowed like captured starlight, and devices that hurt to look at directly. "They're going for the treasure," Marcus realized, his military training automatically cataloging threats and tactical positions. They know the map is active, know that whatever Blackwater hid is trying to surface. But even as he formed the thought, he understood that letting them claim the treasure would be far worse than anything he'd experienced in Afghanistan. This wasn't just about gold or historical artifacts. If Uncle Jeremiah's journals were accurate, the Blackwater Hoard was a collection of spiritual energy accumulated through centuries of murder and sacrifice, a battery of concentrated malevolence that could power rituals capable of reshaping reality itself. He had to stop them. Somehow, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, despite facing enemies that weren't entirely human, he had to find a way to protect whatever remained of the binding that kept the Deep Ones locked away from the world. Marcus made his way back to the storage room, Rex following close behind. The chest sat where he'd left it, but now it was glowing with soft phosphorescent light that pulsed in rhythm with something he couldn't identify. His heartbeat, maybe? Or the rhythm of waves against the shore? He opened the chest again and carefully removed the map, gasping as its surface flared with brilliant radiance the moment his skin made contact. The coastline was clearly visible, rendered in impossible detail. But now it showed not just geographical features, but the movement of every living thing within miles. The ghost ships were clearly marked, drifting inexorably toward a cove about 2 miles south of the lighthouse. Victoria Harrington's team appeared as clusters of cold blue light moving along predetermined paths, their formation suggesting military training and supernatural guidance. And there, deep beneath the waves, something vast and patient was rising toward the surface. "The Deep One," Marcus breathed, recognizing the creature from his nightmare. "It's coming to collect what it's owed." But there was something else on the map, something that made his blood run cold, a marker directly beneath the lighthouse itself, pulsing with malevolent energy that seemed to reach up through fathoms of solid rock. The treasure wasn't hidden in some distant cave or buried on a remote beach. It was here, directly below the lighthouse, in chambers that had been carved from the bedrock itself. Uncle Jeremiah's final journal entries suddenly made terrible sense. The lighthouse hadn't been built to guide ships safely to shore. It had been constructed as a prison, its light serving not as a beacon, but as a ward, keeping the accumulated power of the Blackwater Hoard locked away in the deep places where it couldn't corrupt the world above. Marcus's phone buzzed, the first time it had worked since he'd arrived at the lighthouse, and he glanced at the screen to see a text message from an unknown number. "You have something that belongs to us, Mr. Cole. Bring the map to Seal Cove in 1 hour, and we'll make this easy for everyone involved. Refuse, and we'll take it from your corpse after we feed your dog to things that swim in the spaces between dreams." Rex snarled at the phone, as if he could smell the malevolence behind the message, and Marcus felt his own anger rising. These creatures had threatened Rex, had made the one mistake guaranteed to override his survival instincts and tactical thinking. "Nobody threatens my dog," he said quietly, his voice carrying the edge that had made Taliban fighters step back when he'd interrogated them in the mountains of Afghanistan. Nobody. He carefully folded the map and slipped it into his jacket pocket, then made his way to Uncle Jeremiah's bedroom closet. His uncle had been a veteran too, Vietnam according to the discharge papers Marcus found among the personal effects, and like most combat veterans, he'd kept certain supplies on hand for emergencies. The rifle was an old M1 Garand, well-maintained and wrapped in oiled cloth. A wooden crate beneath it held ammunition, field gear, and several items that definitely hadn't been issued by any military Marcus knew of: silver bullets, carved bone talismans, and a combat knife whose blade had been etched with the same symbols Marcus had seen throughout the lighthouse. "Looks like Uncle Jeremiah was ready for this kind of fight," Marcus murmured, checking the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. Rex sat beside him, no longer pacing, but alert and focused, ready for whatever came next. As Marcus loaded the rifle and checked his equipment, he found himself thinking about his squad mates from Afghanistan: Rodriguez, who'd saved his life during the Kandahar ambush; Thompson, who taught him to see patterns in chaos and find order in impossible situations; Williams, who'd shown him that sometimes the only way to protect innocent people was to do terrible things to guilty ones. They were gone now, all of them, claimed by roadside bombs or sniper fire or the slow poison of memories that wouldn't heal. But their training lived on in Marcus, their voices echoing in his mind as he prepared for what might be his final mission. "Stay low, stay quiet, and trust your instincts," Rodriguez had always said. "The enemy can lie to your eyes and your ears, but they can't fool your gut." Marcus's gut was telling him that the next few hours would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone who lived within 1,000 miles of this cursed lighthouse. If Victoria Harrington and her Deep One masters managed to claim the Blackwater treasure, if they succeeded in breaking the bindings that had kept ancient horrors locked away from the world, then the carefully maintained boundary between nightmare and reality would collapse entirely. He made his way back to the observation deck, Rex at his side, and began studying the tactical situation with the cold precision that had kept him alive through 3 tours in hostile territory. The ghost ships were holding position about a mile offshore, their crews waiting for some signal Marcus couldn't identify. Harrington's team had split into 3 groups, one moving toward the lighthouse from the north, one from the south, and a third that seemed to be setting up some kind of ritual circle on the beach directly below. As Marcus watched through the lighthouse lens, the third group began their work. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit, but their equipment belonged in no earthly arsenal. Carved poles were driven into the sand, their surfaces crawling with symbols that seemed to move independently of the wind. A circle was drawn in what looked like phosphorescent paint, but the substance glowed with its own internal light and left traces of bioluminescent residue wherever it touched. And at the center of the circle, they placed something that made Marcus's vision blur and his head pound with sudden, brutal pain. It was roughly cylindrical, about the size of a car battery, but made from some material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface writhed with patterns that hurt to perceive directly, and occasionally, things that might have been tentacles or might have been optical illusions emerged from its depths before withdrawing back into whatever impossible space the object contained. A summoning focus, Marcus realized, the knowledge arriving in his mind fully formed as if someone else had placed it there. They're going to use it to call the Deep One up from whatever trench it's been sleeping in.
Rex whined and pressed closer to Marcus's leg, the dog's instinct screaming danger, even though he couldn't possibly understand what he was seeing. But Rex had always been able to sense things that escaped human perception: the presence of hidden explosives, the approach of enemy fighters, the subtle wrongness that preceded supernatural manifestations. If Rex said something terrible was about to happen, then something terrible was about to happen. Marcus checked his rifle one final time, then began making his way down the lighthouse's spiral staircase. Every step echoed in the confined space, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to harmonize with the pulsing of the map in his jacket pocket. The symbols carved into the walls were glowing now, responding to whatever energy was building on the beach below, and Marcus could feel their attention like weight pressing against his consciousness. He reached the bottom of the lighthouse just as the first group of attackers arrived at the door. Through the thick glass panels, Marcus could see three figures in tactical gear, their faces hidden behind masks that reflected the lighthouse beam in ways that defied optics. They moved with fluid precision, covering each other's approaches and communicating through hand signals that Marcus recognized despite their inhuman efficiency. Rex positioned himself between Marcus and the door, hackles raised and teeth bared. The dog's message was clear: whatever came through that door would have to go through him first. Marcus raised the rifle to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel at the lead figure. The silver bullets Uncle Jeremiah had left behind felt warm against his palm, as if they were eager to fulfill their purpose. He'd killed before, in service to his country and in defense of innocent lives. He could do it again, if necessary. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, the attackers simply vanished. Not invisibility, not tactical concealment, but genuine disappearance, as if they'd never been there at all. Illusions, Marcus breathed, lowering the rifle. They're testing our defenses, trying to get us to reveal our capabilities. Rex barked once, sharp and urgent, and Marcus spun toward the sound to see water streaming under the storage room door. Not rainwater or seepage from the morning dew, but seawater, thick and briny and carrying the smell of things that had been dead for a very long time. The water spread across the lighthouse floor in patterns that definitely weren't random, forming symbols that matched the ones carved into the walls. Where it touched the stone, the surfaces began to glow with the same phosphorescent light Marcus had seen on the beach, and he realized with growing horror that the lighthouse itself was being converted into some kind of massive ritual focus. "They're not trying to break in," he said, his voice barely audible above Rex's increasingly frantic barking. "They're trying to wake up whatever's sleeping beneath us." As if in response to his words, the lighthouse shuddered, not from wind or wave action, but from something moving far below, something vast and patient that had been waiting centuries for the right combination of circumstances to stir from its ancient slumber. The Blackwater treasure wasn't just hidden beneath the lighthouse. It was alive, aware, and very, very hungry.
Marcus grabbed Rex's collar and began pulling the dog toward the staircase, but before they could reach it, the water on the floor began to rise. Not flooding, the level was increasing uniformly throughout the lighthouse, as if the entire structure was sinking into some impossible ocean that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. Through the rising water, Marcus could see shapes moving, human figures at first, but wrong somehow. Too tall and too thin, and moving with the flowing grace of creatures born to swim through fathoms of liquid darkness. Their faces were hidden behind masks of corroded silver, and when they turned toward Marcus, their eyes burned with the cold light of bioluminescent predators. "The Blackwater Brotherhood," Marcus whispered, recognition hitting him like a physical blow. "They never died. They've been waiting down there, guarding the treasure, keeping it safe until the deep ones could rise again." One of the figures raised its hand, pointing directly at Marcus with fingers that were too long and ended in claws designed to tear through flesh and bone. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of waves crashing against hollow caverns, distorted by centuries of submersion, but still intelligible. "The map, Keeper's blood. Give us the map, and your death will be swift." Marcus raised the rifle again, but even as he did, he could see more figures emerging from the waters that now reached his knees and showed no signs of stopping its rise. Rex was swimming now, his powerful strokes keeping him afloat, but the dog's eyes were wide with the kind of primal terror that came from facing something that violated every natural law. "Come and take it," Marcus snarled, chambering a silver bullet with movements made automatic by years of training. The lead figure smiled, revealing teeth like broken glass and a mouth that opened far wider than any human jaw should allow. "As you wish, Keeper's blood, but know that your defiance only delays the inevitable. The deep ones rise with the tide, and when they walk among the surface world once more, your lighthouse will become their first temple, your blood the first offering of a new age." Marcus pulled the trigger, and the silver bullet struck the creature's center mass with an impact that should have dropped any living target. But the Blackwater pirate only staggered, black ichor streaming from the wound, and when it looked up again, its smile had become something that belonged in the deepest nightmares of drowning men. "Silver burns, Keeper's blood, but it cannot kill what was never truly alive. We are the tide that claims all shores, the darkness that swallows all light. You cannot fight the ocean itself." The water continued to rise, and Marcus realized with cold certainty that conventional weapons weren't going to be enough. Whatever these creatures were, however they'd been transformed by centuries of submersion and service to entities that predated human civilization, they were beyond the reach of bullets and blades. But he still had the map, still had the one thing they needed to complete their ritual. As long as he kept it from them, as long as he could find a way to disrupt their summoning circle, there might still be hope. Rex barked once, urgent and commanding, and Marcus looked up to see the dog swimming toward the spiral staircase. The German shepherd's message was clear. Higher ground, tactical advantage, better defensive position. Marcus began wading through the rising water, the rifle held above his head as ghostly pirates closed in from all sides. The lighthouse beam swept across the Atlantic, and in its glow, Marcus could see the ghost ships moving closer to shore, their spectral crews preparing to disembark into boats that seemed to be carved from whalebone and midnight. But it was what he saw on the beach that made his blood freeze in his veins.
Victoria Harrington stood at the center of the ritual circle, but she was no longer bothering to maintain her human disguise. Her business suit had dissolved into something that looked like living seaweed, and her carefully styled hair now hung in tendrils that moved independently of any earthly wind. Her skin had taken on the pale, translucent quality of deep-sea creatures, and when she raised her arms to begin the summoning chant, Marcus could see gills fluttering along her elongated neck. "The stars are right," her voice carried across the water, amplified by acoustics that belonged to no terrestrial science. "The barriers weaken, and the deep ones stir in their ancient cities beneath the waves. Tonight, the covenant sworn by Ezra Blackwater shall be fulfilled, and the surface world shall remember the old masters who ruled before humanity crawled from the primordial slime." The cylindrical artifact at the center of the circle pulsed with malevolent energy, and Marcus watched in horror as the ocean around it began to bubble and steam. Something was rising from the depths, something so vast and alien that the water itself seemed to recoil from its presence. Rex whined and pressed against Marcus's leg, the dog's instincts screaming danger in ways that transcended species barriers. But even as terror threatened to overwhelm him, Marcus felt a strange clarity descending over his mind. This was what he'd been trained for. Not the specific threat, maybe, but the principle. Protect the innocent. Hold the line. Never surrendered to forces that would destroy everything good in the world. He pulled Uncle Jeremiah's final journal from his jacket and flipped to the last entries, reading by the lighthouse beam that swept